Chamber. My name is Michelle Wu, and I chair the Council's Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation. We are here for a hearing on docket number 1045, order for a hearing regarding the expansion of city development requirements with a focus on achieving baseline tree preservation and total tree capacity on a development site. I'm joined by my colleagues, Councillor Tim McCarthy, who is the sponsor of this hearing, as well as Councillor Ed Flynn. I want to remind everyone that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live on channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, as well as streaming on the City of Boston website. Please silence your cell phones and other devices, and if you would like to testify, we will take public testimony throughout the hearing, so please check the appropriate boxes at the sign-in sheets by the door. Let's see. Okay, so at this point, just so we know what is happening, I will ask my colleagues, welcome Councillor Garrison as well. I will ask my colleagues to give brief opening statements. Then with the indulgence of our esteemed administration panel, I will take the first three people who have signed up to testify from the public, and then we'll dive right into Q&A with the panel. And then if there's anyone else, we'll finish up public testimony of those who've signed in and anyone else who feels moved to speak at that point. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and thanks everybody for being here. Really, this conversation started on a Sunday morning at George Wright Golf Course with my friend Richie Murphy, who is here. You know, we were talking about developments and things that were going on in the city, and I happened to mention that there was a development, an as-of-right development that happened right by my house, and they built two duplexes. Originally, he thought about 3, but I told him no, he was going to jam it in. So he put 2 in there, which was completely as of right. And great developer. The 4 families that live there now, awesome. They love our neighborhood, and they're certainly welcome. But in the process, they were prefab houses, and in the process, he removed, I'm going to guess, anywhere from 8 to 12 100-year oaks. He raised a single family, 3-family that was there, and then just kind of clear cut. Now, he did plant some trees, and that was fantastic, and it does look really, really nice. But I think that if there was something that triggered, if we had something in place that would say, whoa, pump the brakes here, maybe we can swing those houses in a different way. Maybe we can help you in any way to try to keep those trees. And then, so I mentioned it to Murph, and we started having the conversation. And then I started digging deeper and deeper. And he was talking about some things that Brookline has. So then we did a lot of research, and now I have Concord and Wellesley and Lexington and Newton and Brookline and a lot of people's, their codes and policies regarding tree removal and what mitigation packages to give back. And as we know, and Chief Cook knows more than anybody with his outstanding work on the climate change and climate ready Boston, keeping as many trees as possible is necessary. And I enjoy these hearings because everybody here is going to row in the right direction. We're going to row in the same direction, and through working sessions, we'll probably pull a lot of this stuff apart. But as you know, the first step is a hearing. So here we are. I want to thank Councilor Wu for expediting the hearing, and thank you for my fellow colleagues for being here, and I'm looking forward to getting into the trenches. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing and for your commitment to environmental justice. I also want to thank the maker, Councilor McCarthy, for his leadership on this critical issue for the future of our city. It is imperative that we as a city discuss our goals for planting trees and how we can get there during this unprecedented development boom in our city. I want to say thank you to Commissioner Chris Cook for the important work that he and Mayor Walsh are doing in the administration. This issue is so important in terms of our environment and health, as our trees contribute to climate control, reduce heat by cooling the air, reduce or remove air pollutants. Our trees in open space are also beneficial to our residents in terms of mental health, stress relief, and our well-being. As Councilor McCarthy illustrates in his hearing order, we have a goal to plant 10,000 trees in the city of Boston. We have planted 10,000 and removed 6,000. We have a lot of work to do on this issue, this important issue, to address our environment and climate change, heat reduction, and the mental health of our residents. In terms of tree preservation, I also want to highlight the negative impact gas leaks have on our trees and their health as well. I frequently exchange communication with mothers out front on gas leaks that are happening throughout the city, and they're doing excellent work on behalf of our residents as well. Just this week, a neighbor in South Boston also sent me photos of 3 trees in the K and 6th Street area of South Boston that are now dead or dying. We have notified the Parks Department and also National Grid to see if this is a gas leak that is causing the death of these trees. And I'm really not satisfied with National Grid in their response to the ongoing gas leaks that are taking place in our city. They need to do a better job. We also had a lot of trees that came down during a microburst from the storm a few weeks ago. So many neighbors were upset by the great trees we lost at Marine Park and Castle Island. This is a quality of life. It has an impact on everybody. We need to continue working closely with city government, state government, to make sure that we have as many trees as we possibly can during this economic boom. And again, I just want to thank Councilor McCarthy, Councilor Wu, Commissioner Cook, and the Mayor's administration for their work on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Garrison.
It is indeed a great to be a member of the Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation, and I welcome this hearing on expansion of planned trees and preservation of current trees. I would like to thank Chairperson Michelle Wu for sponsoring this order. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Garrison. So as mentioned, I would like to call up Carol Blair, Caroline Toth, and David Mccallum for public comment. And if you could please just state your name, your address for the record, and keep to a 2-minute time frame, that would be much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you, Carol.
I have copies of my testimony if anyone wants those. My name is Carol Blair. I'm president of Chester Square Neighbors. My address is 222 Northampton Street. Is that it? Okay. I grew up in Vermont before the interstate highway system cut through the mountains. But for 43 years now, I've lived in the South End, where my bedroom window is barely 6 feet from my neighbors. I no longer take trees for granted. I often stop, taking strength from a rugged ancient tree or commiserating with a struggling sapling. This week, I took a walk with Bob Barney, president of Claremont Neighborhood, to survey trees at sites of recent and proposed developments in our 2 neighborhoods. Bob's chart shows 98 trees at the 7 sites, including city trees in the sidewalk. You can see the attachment for those. Of these, 77 appear to be slated for removal or vulnerable to root and canopy damage. Can we save any of these trees? And then how can we replace the trees that are lost? Perhaps more importantly, how can we maintain space for future trees to grow? In the 1800s, when South End architects imitated London's layout, they added trees, understanding that trees offer abundant health benefits. South End trees thrive where buildings are set back from the street, allowing space for tree roots and branches to develop into a mature tree with a full canopy. Today's developments often build near or at the edge of the sidewalk, reducing green space to small plantings or no green at all. To preserve a healthful tree canopy for our city, we need to nurture and protect existing trees, but also protect and provide for green spaces. Zoning, permitting, and planning must include trees and green space as a key parameter. I want trees for my grandchildren.
Thank you, Carol.
I'll leave the copies here.
Yes, thank you. Caroline?
Hello, 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 hello.
It'll come on as you speak.
Oh, great. My name is Caroline Toth Bernstein. I live at 10 William Street in Roxbury. I've lived in Lower Roxbury for 15 years. I lived there with my son, who's 8, and my husband, Greg. I'm here to talk to you about a construction project in Lower Roxbury that plans to remove over 100 healthy and mature trees that are more than 40 years old. This project, if completed as planned, will perpetrate the destructive health effects of Boston's largest and hottest heat island. Heat islands are areas that absorb and radiate solar energy due to the amount of buildings and paved surfaces and lack of tree cover. This August, the New York Times published an article titled, "Summer in the City is Hot, but Some Neighborhoods Suffer More." This article reports, as the United States suffers through a summer of record-breaking heat, new research shows that temperatures on a scorching summer day can vary as much as 20 degrees across different parts of the same city, with poor and minority neighborhoods often bearing the brunt of this heat. Few trees to clean and cool the air, heat islands make it harder to breathe and contribute to health issues, particularly for those in vulnerable communities. In fact, Climate Ready Boston determines Roxbury is a stressed neighborhood in many ways. The vast majority of the populations of this neighborhood falls into at least one vulnerable category, and most fall into several categories, including older adults, children, people of color, limited English, low to no income, medical illness, and disabilities. The heat island effect disproportionately impacts the health and well-being of Lower Roxbury residents today and is an issue of environmental justice. This large construction project, on track and approved to remove over 100 trees in Boston's largest and hottest heat island, is not a private development designed by greedy developers trying to maximize their profits. No, this project is designed by the City of Boston for the reconstruction of Melniacas Boulevard, in complete ignorance of the findings and commitments spelled out in Climate Ready Boston. This negligence is unconscionable. Trees mitigate and can reverse the effects of heat islands. The mature trees on Melniacas Boulevard protect the health and well-being of the residents of Lower Roxbury. The City of Boston needs to put into actions its commitment and protect its residents with real and implemented guidelines to preserve and grow its tree canopy. The health of the city's residents depends on it.
Thank you, Caroline. I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. And finally, David.
Thank you. My name is David Meshulam. I'm executive director and co-founder with Amanda Rich behind me of a new nonprofit called Speak for the Trees. Thank you, Councilor McCarthy. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Councilor Wu. Nice to see you and so many friendly other faces who've come to visit some of our work this summer. We have been busy at Speak for the Trees inventorying street trees, and just today I received notice from our program coordinator that we have just completed inventorying all the street trees in Roxbury, and I invite people to look at our map at opentreemap.org/Boston. I wanted to begin by thanking then Park Commissioner Cook for putting in a line item last year for $100,000 for a new LiDAR study that I think will help move this conversation forward. Another data point of understanding where we're losing trees and where our richest canopy is going to be critical to come up with a plan to make sure that we're not losing canopy and in fact growing canopy. And there's been research recently done at BU by Professor Gutierrez, and I'd like to speak to some of her findings because I think they're relevant to the conversation today. Boston has a goal of reaching 35% tree canopy coverage by 2030. We are now at about 27%, and we've been stable for the past decade or so around that number of 27%. Professor Gutierrez's research suggests that if we continue losing trees at the rate we're losing and increase our new tree planting, we will not be able to get to that 35% canopy coverage. And her research strongly suggests that the best way to increase our canopy is by decreasing healthy tree mortality by 20%, and only then can we start to grow the size and the health benefits of our urban forest. As you know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, the environmental impacts of losing that canopy are frightening in an era of climate change. We've seen some really hot summer days that often tend to, as the last speaker just said, impact communities that are facing some of the gravest challenges and are on heat islands. We also have wetter springs, and trees mitigate against some stormwater runoff, and then the mental benefits of trees. And I just wanted to point to two recent research articles that I think also will help us think about what our goal is and how we're going to get there. Recent research showed that at 30% and more canopy coverage, so if you were to take a satellite image, mental benefits for residents increases, and the cooling effect of trees really only takes place at around 40% canopy coverage. So if we're thinking about this holistically, we really need to think about where those trees are, how we take care of those big trees, while also making sure that we're planting and caring for the newly planted trees that tend to have a hard time establishing themselves. And I'm going to just end with one quote from Gutierrez's paper. Removal of large trees for redevelopment is often justified by replanting several seedlings in its place. But high mortality rates and the time required for a seedling to reach full stature can result in a sustained canopy decline for many years. Tree planting efforts alone seem insufficient to increase canopy cover. Policymakers should consider alternative strategies to reduce mortality rates of large trees. So I thank you, Councilor McCarthy, for starting this conversation. Large trees are critical. I hope we can continue to think of ways to maintain our largest and most beneficial trees.
Thank you, David. And again, for anyone else, we'll pick up with public testimony after the panel discussion. I want to recognize that we've also been joined by Councilor Mark Siomo, Councilor Matt O'Malley, Councilor Michael Flaherty, and Councilor Anissa Asabi-George. So we'll turn it over to the panel. Thank you, Chief. I know you have a time commitment as well, and you were making time for our expedited hearing, so let us know.
I'm thrilled to be here, and I apologize for the existing time commitment. I think it might be useful for just the panel to introduce themselves, and then I have a brief opening statement. So my name is Chris Cook. I'm the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston.
Mike Christopher, I'm the Deputy Director of Development Review at the Boston Planning and Development Agency.
Michael Canizzo, the Interim Deputy Director of Urban Design.
Hi, I'm Jill Zick. I'm with the Urban Design Department. I'm the Staff Landscape Architect at the Boston Planning and Development Agency.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, councilors, and certainly thank you, Councilor McCarthy, for sponsoring today's council hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to speak for both the importance of the trees, but also the City of Boston's strategic thinking in regards to urban forestry. As reflected in the hearing order, as well as the testimony that we've already heard and that we're going to hear throughout the day, trees are indispensable to the health and future of Boston. I think I will I won't articulate as I won't pontificate on the benefits of trees because I think everyone in the room probably recognizes the benefits of the trees, but just very quickly, in addition to beautifying the city, they reduce air, water, noise pollution, process stormwater, reduce soil erosion, reduce the heat island effect in urban areas, and then certainly from an economic development standpoint, trees are empirically shown to increase property values, decrease energy costs, and promote economic vitality. So trees are infrastructure to cities, and they're certainly infrastructure to the city of Boston. As such, Boston's planting and care is supported by both its capital and operating budgets. It is with gratitude that I acknowledge the investment that actually David had mentioned earlier that Mayor Martin J. Walsh and this council made with the adoption of this year's budget. Critically, that budget included funds for updated LIDAR data and an updated canopy analysis. With these investments, Boston will be able to understand the change, trends, and health of our tree canopy. This information will set the table for the development of an urban forestry master plan for the city of Boston. The Urban Forestry Master Plan will include collaboration with key departments and agencies that have a role in the protection or expansion of tree canopy in the city. Obviously, the Parks and Recreation Department, the Environment Department, Boston Water and Sewer Commission, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, Public Works Department, Boston Transportation Department, state agencies, as well as private and most importantly, nonprofit partners and citizens. The Urban Forestry Plan will assess national and international best practices for increasing tree canopy, set goals for canopy protection and expansion for the next 20 years, and relevant perhaps most relevant to this hearing, develop a strategy to meet those goals, including policy recommendations, funding and partnership strategies, ordinances and enforcement, and an action plan for implementation. Recommended improvements to tree protection strategies for public and private properties will be considered, and we will also develop a planting strategy by neighborhood focused on localization, prioritization, species selection, and succession planning for parks and streets, with an emphasis on equity. We need to inform the process, content, and maintenance of a neighborhood-by-neighborhood tree inventory that will also provide tree size and species information. Inventory itself may not be part of this plan because some of the volunteer efforts may be sufficient at that time, or we may undertake an official tree inventory citywide at that time. Recommended changes needed to the current operational and maintenance practices to achieve these plans' goals will be considered. So we look forward to partnering with the council throughout this entire process. We're very excited that the LiDAR data will be available to us. The LiDAR is scheduled to take place over the next few weeks. We'll be able to analyze the data before the winter. We're happy to share that with the council and work through the climate ready plans, the climate action plan with the council and with our partner agencies to develop this urban forestry master plan. And we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Would anyone else like to chime in before I turn it over to Q&A?
No, I would just say thank you to Council McCarthy and Councilor Wu for hosting the hearing, and thank you for the advocates for showing up. And, you know, we're here really just for a conversation to see, you know, it's obviously an important part of the work we do every day, and hearings like this can really help us inform, you know, future conversations. So we're here for, you know, for open conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll hand it over to Councilor McCarthy then, and I will just set a gentle timer for each of my colleagues since there are so many of us, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, that's pretty good. That's better than I usually give out. So, you know, as I said in my opening statement, I have a lot of information. I want to thank Lee Blasi and Nita Holder from my office for digging into all of these towns. Concord, Wellesley, Lexington, Newton, there's a bunch more, Brookline. And the reason being is I think that we can take a lot from what they do. I know some of them have, you know, they have a general tree fund, which I know we do have. We had.
Yeah, so I'll speak very briefly about it. So we do have a tree fund that is replenished through the removals of street trees that have to be removed due to construction, and that is to finance either the replacement of street trees or the Parks Department's replacement of street, and that's specific to the right-of-way.
Right.
Yeah.
So you know, other towns pay, let's say a developer needs a variance and they have to remove a 100-year oak. They pay by the inch, chest high. How many inches the tree is, that's how much you pay, that goes into the fund. Or that, you know, there's some type of formula that we can work out. And by dissecting a lot of other towns' ordinances, I think we can come up with something unique for Boston that works for Boston. Some pay per tree, which doesn't really make sense because if you take down a 100-year oak and you plant a 3-inch maple, it's not the same. So, you know, these are the things I want to talk about. And I know Chris and I talked offline, Chief and I talked offline about, there was a program a while ago about planting trees on private property, front yards. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, yeah. So the Parks and Recreation Department, at a time where it was becoming increasingly challenging, whether there's ADA constraints or other constraints on sidewalks, to find planting locations in certain neighborhoods, they offered a program where they would actually plant in people's yards. Over time, that practice was discontinued, but that is an available practice that we could either rekindle or reevaluate.
Right, and I love that for many reasons, because coming from the Public Works Department, I know during harsh winters we're firing salt, and salt and tree pits don't work very well together. It's just the reality. So we plant new trees, and if the neighbors aren't neighborly and they don't water them, issues happen, you know, and we've done a really nice job at planting, you know, a whole, on West Street right in front of George Wright, for instance, we planted like 6 or 7 trees, but they were across the street from residents. The golf course doesn't have the ability to water those trees, and most of those trees have now perished. But if we brought, on the redesign of George Wright, what we're doing, I know we're going to put some trees behind the wall, which makes a lot of sense. But I look at a lot of the streets, and I think my colleagues will say, as well as, you know, everybody here lives in Boston, you know, we see people who could have the possibility of putting a nice tree in their front yard, but maybe don't have the means. So if we're charging developers per inch and lot line to lot line buildings are built, I would say like in Councilor O'Malley's district on Weldon Center, there was a nice development. It's going to be beautiful when it's done, but they went lot line to lot line. They probably removed 15 to 20 trees. I don't know how much money that would have been ultimately at the end, but maybe with a new ordinance, there might be money for that tree fund. And maybe somebody in JP or West Roxbury in that immediate area has the lawn sufficient enough to take a tree. And I know that on my front lawn, for instance, I have no trees on my side of the street because the wires run on my side. Having said that, I'd love to have a tree on my front lawn. Would be nice. So, you know, that's just one of the thoughts that I have as we're going in this. So, I guess this is more for Mike. Are there any current requirements in the application process that would review, like trigger review for existing trees on the lot?
I mean, I think, so I just speak into this, right, so it works, right? As we evaluate projects, I think, you know, through the pre-file stage, we're always looking at kind of what's existing on the site and what's being proposed. And I think when we're evaluating the site beforehand, we're looking at, you know, is there specific, you know, trees that are of a certain age that should look at being preserved. And I would defer to my colleagues. I don't think specifically there is guidelines within the Article 80 review, but it's definitely something that we're always looking at as we kind of start the development review process.
Because some developers are better, and I know Michael will be familiar with this project, and on River Street in Hyde Park Ave, it used to be Superior, River Street in Hyde Park used to be Superior Carpet. It literally looked like a white shoebox. It was just a gross building. Superior Carpet moved along. Developer came in. I want to say, I think you reviewed that, or it was in your ballpark. They put on a third floor, made a beautiful third floor, but the landscaping out front, they planted a couple dogwoods, they planted some bushes. It looks stunning. So sometimes I see really, oh, that was 5 minutes. Stuff really, you know, projects done really, really well, and others not as aggressive with the plantings.
Council, we do require them to do a landscaping plan. That is part of all the project review, even from a small Board of Appeals project to a large project. We do approve that plan. And we don't have the resource to go out to make sure that they actually execute the plan. But by and large, most of the plans that we do approve are executed. So that's a very important piece of the review process.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Wu. And Commissioner Cook, can you talk about the outreach the City of Boston is doing, working with National Grid on gas leaks that are really killing our trees? It's a huge problem. I know Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Wu work closely with Mothers Out Front on these issues, but what is some of the issues we're having with National Grid?
So the primary point of contact for National Grid is the Public Works Department and their work through the PIC process. That being said, I would say that the Environment Department and our cabinet, our primary interaction with them is actually in conjunction with the advocates. So whether it's the sponsoring of legislation, so recently the administration had legislation in order to set up a fining structure for gas leaks, and specifically to address the smaller to mid-size leaks that we think are actually contributing to the tree canopy loss in the city of Boston. Or whether or not it's actually going to public events with groups like Mothers Out Front or BCAN or other groups to support that legislation. That is typically the process that the Climate Action Plan and the Environment Department's going through. As far as the direct access and the utilities and the actual coordination, that's been going typically through the Public Works Department, and then they bring us in as needed.
Do we have any idea of how many trees we've lost across the city due to gas leaks?
It's just anecdotal, Councilor, but because there's so many stresses on trees in the urban environment, and I'm talking specifically about trees in the right-of-way. They're the ones that are most likely to be hurt by gas leaks. That being said, it's all over the city. And it's typically very easy to identify a tree that is suffering from a gas leak. It's typically starts with the top of the canopy die off. It's significant, and when you start looking at that these are capital dollars, yes, some of these trees are under warranty, it is frustrating because you can feel like you're wasting money at certain times. So we certainly support all the efforts to get as many leaks fixed as possible. And we also need to be more strategic, and I have to give credit where credit's due to the Urban Forestry Division of Parks and Recreation. They're really trying to not put a round peg into a square hole. They're trying to be judicious about if there's a known location that has been problematic for a street tree, you know, don't keep planting in that location. Try to find another place for that street tree.
Thank you, Chris. And my final question. Chris, in the south end, I see a lot of trees that also have a place where residents can place water at the top of the tree. What's the name of that program, and what's the objective of it?
So with our new spec on all of our tree plantings that are in the right-of-way, and actually the tree plantings that we're doing in most of our park projects now, is to actually place the water bag on the supporting ropes that are attached to the tree. The reason for that is to not encourage tree rot at the base of the tree.
Okay.
So typically the water bags used to be like right around the trunk of the tree at the bottom. What we found is that, you know, mildew and other things that could be harmful to the tree, including trash, could be collected in those bags. So moving them off to those poles, it's still getting, the water theoretically is still getting to the root system, but not the bad stuff is not surrounding the trunk. But that's part of the spec of our new trees.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Garrison.
I just have one question. Chris, as I go up across the city of Boston, there's a lot of older trees and the roots are breaking through the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Is there any program that would address these trees?
Yeah, so it's a significant problem. So one thing that I think we should be really proud of in the city is that we really prioritize access, and we exceed ADA code, especially through our Complete Streets program. What I will say, in a city as old as ours, and especially as you go around the city and you see some of these 80, 100-year-old trees that are actually pulling up the root systems, that gets very complicated when the Public Works Department or a private developer who's fixing the public realm has to address those ADA concerns in it. And often what you'll find is that in addressing the sidewalk, the root systems of that tree will actually suffer. And the lateral support for that tree, because you think about it, you know, it's very difficult for the tree to be growing into the street, so the tree can only grow in certain directions. As you start to level off that sidewalk, you can actually reduce the support for that tree, and then within a year or so, the health of the tree can be compromised. We've been very impressed at models not only internationally and nationally, but regionally, with the use of rubberized surfacing in strategic places where you're still allowing a porous surface so water can get to the root systems. So working with the Public Works Department, working with their Complete Streets team, we do have a few pilots of employing that, and then also using other paving strategies. However, when we redo streets and we have massive trees, frankly, we're just gonna have to start making room for those big trees.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ms. Garrison. I know your time is running short. Chief, could you just, before we move on, address the issue that was brought up by Ms. Toth, and I believe others will bring up later, on Melnia Cass,
Sure.
the 100 trees. I have not heard from a single person who wants it to continue, including the cyclist community, to lose those trees. So I don't know if there's update or what the actual status is.
Well, I'd have to, in order to give you a specific update, I know the project generally because it's a BTD project and it's a public works project. Right now, they're tracking at a two for one replacement strategy for the trees. Now, I think David from Speak for the Trees brought up the excellent point of Dr. Hutera's research from Boston University, that there's a premium on the value of large trees. So it takes a tree a long time to sequester the kind of carbon that a large tree is sequestering. This is complicated when you're doing major infrastructure transportation projects or just any major infrastructure projects in the city, and you have to counterbalance these aspects. So we've participated in the process in reviewing some of the removals, and in fact, we've actually participated at the Boston Parks and Recreation Department in some removals. There's a significant amount of ash trees that are in the mix out there. With the presence of emerald ash borer, you worry about the health of that. But there are going to be healthy trees that are lost as part of this project. Our hope is that there's significant co-benefits with the project too, whether it's the multimodal transportation, it's the increased stormwater management that Boston Water and Sewer Commission is doing on the street, and then obviously the planting of the trees. I'll defer to Chief Osgood, but I think also the intention is, because of the canopy loss on that project, I believe they're planning on planting higher caliper trees, and then also intentionally working with the Parks and Recreation Department to plant other trees in the Roxbury neighborhood to minimize the effect.
Okay, thank you. We'll follow up with Chief Osgood too. Sorry for the jumping in. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councilor McCarthy, for your leadership on this. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to all who we will hear from shortly. So, Chris, the LiDAR study will be conducted in
the next few weeks, and that'll be the flyover.
Okay. And the last time we had sort of a comprehensive study such as this was probably predated both of us.
Well, yeah, it was compiled the last time in 2014.
Okay, I guess we were here then.
But that was just the compiling. It was still old data.
Understood. And a lot of, I think, the data that we're currently looking at, for folks probably more in the weeds here than others, but a lot of it is relied on Google Maps and other sort of GIS mapping, which wouldn't give the whole picture, so to speak.
That's fair. So the benefit of the LiDAR, the flyover system, is that it can actually determine what is a tree and what is a shrub or what is lawn.
Okay, that's fantastic. And so that's, what gets measured gets managed, and that's going to be sort of a crucial step as we go forward to try to grow that canopy. I know my colleagues have talked about sort of the audacious, or ambitious, I should say, goal of Mayor Menino to plant 100,000 new trees, and we are well short of that. But I am encouraged that we have an opportunity to grow that tree canopy. We're actually better than many cities, but we shouldn't take any solace in that because we're also lagging behind, I think, many other cities, and there's an opportunity to really grow that and to get to a respectable number. I don't need to tell you the benefits of more trees are too numerous to count. I would use all of my 5 minutes just talking about it, but suffice it to say, when we talk about the climate crisis and we talk about weather events that can really have adverse effects on public health, it's heat, it's extreme heat. I mean, how many people this summer are gonna pass away because of extreme temperatures? It's a great way to deal with that is the natural cooling that comes with these trees. So. Anything we can do to grow this number, and I think that we have an opportunity, as has been articulated by the author in this hearing order, to look at development to come up. Has there been any talk about, I know you guys do great work in BPDA in terms of sort of negotiating with a large-scale development, making sure that we're able to address this, replant this, but is there any reason why we shouldn't have a codified zoning code that, or piece of the zoning code that mandates X number of trees have to be replanted for every tree that's been removed? And any of you guys can jump in on this if you want to give the chief a break.
Yeah, I mean, not specifically not knowing kind of how that would look and feel, I think we'd be open to a conversation relative to kind of, is there something that could be proposed that would make sense? Jill, I don't know if anything in the past that we've looked at relative to the zoning code and trees, but I think we're welcome a open dialogue on how we evaluate and if there is something we can kind of codify within zone. I think we'd have to really look into it, but I think we were open to have a conversation on that. And I don't know of anything off the top of my hand. I don't know if you do, Jill.
I can just add, I mean, anecdotally,
Do you mind just speaking into the microphone?
Sorry.
It's difficult to hear. Thanks.
Anecdotally, while we're reviewing projects, I mean, we don't have any specific policies or, obviously ordinances or anything, but we definitely require at least 2 to 1, if not more. If we're looking at trees that we're aware that are existing on site, oftentimes when a project comes in for pre-file, they don't have all the survey information available for us at that time. If I'm in the meeting, I certainly am asking for that information to make sure that, we have a full understanding of what the site is in its existing condition so that we understand, what is being taken away as well as what is proposed to be added. So I think it's really important for us to understand that, but oftentimes these projects are very, very early in the discussion stages, and they literally have only just engaged survey or engaged engineering to begin to understand what it is they have on their site.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, again, anecdotally, we get calls from the neighbors to make us aware of the value of existing mature trees on site. And at that point, we'd certainly work with the developer to help them understand the value of the trees that they have on site, the fact that they can't readily replace those really in our lifetime, so that they understand that they need to work around those trees to the best of their ability. And if they cannot, again, we're asking for significant tree planting. But I would also say, in addition to just tree planting, we're looking very, very closely at tree planting conditions. I also made comment to the Public Improvement the Public Improvement Commission, and this is a significant issue across the city with regard to not just planting trees, but planting trees that have enough space over time, that we're irrigating trees whenever we can to help through that establishment period, because we can't have good trees that get to maturity that are sequestering carbon and helping with stormwater unless they're in an active growth period. And until that establishment period, which can be, depending on the type of tree, it can be anywhere from 3 to 8 years, that's not happening. So we need to get beyond that period to really have a shot at having, future mature trees.
Sure. No, and I think that dovetails nicely two things, and I know my time is up, but perhaps it would help you and help the BPDA do their job by having some more codified language in terms of what it would look like for development in terms of replacing trees, also having that oversight in the conditions for which they're planted. But I think that you also underscore a point that was brought up by Councilor Flynn, is that we've got anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 gas leaks in the city of Boston, and they are having a horrific effect on all aspects of, I would say, many aspects of public health and crises and others, but trees as well. And one of the things that when we passed our city council ordinance on gas leaks, it would very much address sort of this and coming up with some remuneration from the utility companies to help offset some of the costs that have been borne by these trees that are, the conditions make it nearly impossible for them to survive. So I think as we go forward, we can also include that and figure out ways that we can both make sure these utility companies pay their fair share and fix the leaks so it doesn't have to be an issue going forward. So thank you, Madam Chair. Mr.
Thank you, Councilor
Sponsor.
O'Malley. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the sponsor. I support his efforts. Decreasing healthy tree mortality and expanding the city's tree capacity is a must for the city, particularly as we're talking about the health of our city and its air quality as well as its continued beautification. So any efforts on that front, I wholeheartely support. Chris, just a couple of questions regarding the role, I guess, that the CPA potentially could play here, which is the Community Preservation Act. A number of community groups and civic organizations that have invited me to attend their monthly meetings and to speak have asked if their respective organizations could put a proposal in to add, I guess, tree capacity in their respective communities. So I'm encouraging them to fill out the application and submit that. Some of them on city property, some of them on DCR property, which I said that at some point, something that you or folks in your office would work closely with DCR if that application was to be approved to be able to plant trees. I think would be it's a fitting purpose for the CPA.
It absolutely is. It's designated as a capital improvement, so it's absolutely appropriate to use CPA funds for trees. And in fact, in the first round, tree planting at Mount Hope was funded.
That's great. And then do we track trees that we lose through storms? I know there was a microburst just a couple of weeks ago. It wiped out, more on the DCR side of the house, but wiped out a lot of trees over in my neighborhood, plus lightning strikes, the winter storms, even motor vehicle accidents. Do we kind of keep a running tab as to how many trees we lose due to weather-related and or other
We do, Counselor. So we have, and we can certainly provide the council with a report. The issue is we don't track the value of those trees. Okay. So often the Urban Forestry Division is going out in emergency and they're removing a tree from a car from the public right away. That tree could be a tree that's 2 years old. That tree could be 50, 60 years old. And so that's what's complicated about calculating the real impact, because it's not about number of trees, it's about that canopy.
Okay. And this is going to go in the pardon the ignorance category, and I know there's folks that probably have the answer to this. And self-proclaimed green thumb, I transplanted an arborvitae and a hydrangea. But can some of these trees be transplanted and relocated? Is that a possibility?
They can. It's difficult. But there's amazing machines, especially primarily used in Europe right now, where there are established tree ordinances and tree protection laws. There are cranes that can remove the entire tree, including the root ball system, and relocate it to other parts of the property. It's often used at major golf courses when they want to change the fairways.
Right. Is that something that we as a city would entertain with respect to large-scale development properties, or things that Councilor McCarthy had outlined when you have sort of an old 100-plus year tree?
So I don't think the city would ever take an active role in actually managing that equipment and doing the work. But as far as something as if there was an established ordinance, or there was, through the design review process, the need to protect a tree, I think we would put that onus on the developer itself.
Right. And thank you for your efforts and always your appreciation and detail. Anytime we're having hearings here, your breadth of knowledge on subject matter around parks and what have you is appreciated. So, and also Mike and the rest of the panel. So, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the sponsor of this hearing order. I think many of my questions have been asked and answered. I do have a question about the thoughtfulness around the assortment of the species of trees planted. Sure. It's something I learned last week with Speak for the Trees. The necessity, because of disease and tree sickness, affects different populations differently. So can you talk a little bit about how thoughtful we are about that?
Sure. So if my landscape architect, Liza Meyer, was here, or our head of the Urban Forestry Division, Greg Mossman, was here, they would roll their eyes because they know I'm going to get a tirade that if I ever see another honey locust again, I'm going to give up. We choose trees for a very specific reason, and I'm talking specifically about the Parks and Recreation street tree plan. We choose trees based on whether or not we think they can survive in an urban environment, and that results in a lot of honey locusts, that results in a lot of ginkgos. We do have a planting list that is available on our website. They're specifically chosen to see whether they can thrive in the urban environment with all the stresses that are placed on them. We have more of a palette to play with, and I'm sure that's not the appropriate landscape architect term, maybe design with is what I should say, Jill, to design with when we look at our parks projects. But what that does create is it creates eras of potential catastrophe. And what I mean by that is there was a period of time in Boston where a lot of elms were planted. Well, now with the proliferation of Dutch elm disease, a significant amount of our canopy is vulnerable. There was a point in time where a significant amount of large DBH ash trees were planted in the city. Well, the emerald ash borer is now potentially in the emerald necklace, and so we could lose a lot of canopy through that. So the diversification, as well as an emphasis on native species where it is appropriate, I think that that's something that our urban forestry master plan would have to take into account. Jill, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Wholeheartedly agree with that. We have, I think 30% of our urban forest is Norway maple right now, so we don't actually actively advocate or plant Norway maple. They're a bit of a weed tree right now for us, and somewhat problematic with regard to some of the issues that have been pointed out through the course of this hearing, with the roots that come up and kind of sear suckering and all kinds of things that are not great for an urban environment, accessibility, things like that. So we're very careful about looking and scrutinizing the list of trees that, in my case, when development projects come through, I look at the list and make sure that,
So are we specifically asking for a certain type of tree depending on the development, the location of the development?
I don't ever specifically ask for any type of tree. What I do is look at what they're proposing and basically cross off the ones that I know are not great for the urban environment.
And then are we following up with developers post, I don't mean to cut you off,
Yep.
but I know my time is limited. Are we then following up with developers to ensure that they planted a tree from the suggested list?
We don't have the capacity to follow up with them to make sure they're planting it, but we do stamp and sign off on drawings that have those trees listed.
And so is
they are-
ISD or whoever the permitting, whoever files or gives the occupancy certificate in the end, are they trained at least to some? I received a small bit of training from Speak From the Trees a few weeks ago, but are they at least aware that they should be looking for a particular type of tree to have been planted?
It depends on the project. Larger projects, certainly, there's, pretty savvy construction managers that are making sure that what's on the plan is what's getting built. I would say as you go down in the scale of project, it becomes less certain as to what's getting planted. I know that I work with a number of homeowners and make suggestions around trees, and they call me and say, I can't get that, it's not available. So we'll work together to do substitutes. But ultimately, what they plant, often, I'm the only landscape architect on staff, so I don't have the ability to go out and check. But I certainly will field those calls and, make substitutions and make sure that, what we're suggesting is in the vein of diversifying the canopy.
Great. And then my last question is, as you may know, I chair education, do a lot of work around our schools, the Boston Public Schools. As BPS goes through significant facilities plan and a number of schools are being renovated and new schools are being built, are we looking at all to schools plans to make sure that those often large parcels of land include a certain level of tree canopy in that redesign?
Yeah, it's an enormous opportunity. So we're meeting with the Build BPS team, primarily looking at the opportunities to engage on Renew Boston Trust and improve the efficiency of the buildings themselves. It's a total missed opportunity if we don't look at the macadam non-porous surfaces that surround the buildings. There's a lot of opportunities for greening and planting. Again, they're products of an era where the focus was on as many parking spaces and as much accessibility as possible. That led to a lot of surfaces that create a heat island effect around ideally an institution where you'd want to cool down the kids as much as possible as soon as they get out of the building. So as they go into the Build BPS, we'll be active participants in that.
Great. Thank you. Chair, that's it for me. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I think Councilor Jane and I were talking. I think we just have BPDA questions anyway. Thank you. Okay, Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I apologize for my lateness. I had an event, a wonderful event in my district around the preservation of affordable housing. Some of the advocates who are here today were actually at that event. Thank you for coming and being here. I just have a couple of questions, and perhaps it's been talked about already. I'm sure some of the advocates who are here have talked about this issue, and I'm not sure if all of the appropriate people who need to respond to these issues are here on the panel, but here they are. I really am very interested in understanding the situation at Melnia, Cass Boulevard, around the tree canopy, and so I'm hearing from different residents about concerns with the removal of trees. My understanding is that I believe 60 of the more mature trees, the plan is to take them down and replant 200 new trees as part of the redesign of Melnia Cass Boulevard. And I guess for me, I really want to understand how we're striking the balance between the preservation of trees in the area with the need to kind of do improvements in the public realm, and is there a way where we can reach kind of this happy middle ground where we're doing both? And so I really just want to understand, one, what that issue is and what the plans are around preserving as many trees as we can, and making sure that the voices of people who have raised concerns in the neighborhoods are being heard and incorporated into the plans. And I'm not suggesting that they haven't been, but I want to understand that that is happening, number one. And then two, whatever happens in this corridor, how we ensure that there will be maintenance. One of the things that is problematic in this area is that there seems to be a lack of follow through in terms of caring for the area. Right now, there's overgrown weeds. The sidewalks are bubbling up because of the mature trees and the root system with the trees. It's kind of, if you walk the area, it's kind of like this merry-go-round. So, you know, from trash pickup, from, you know, cutting back the weeds, to really taking care of new trees, particularly if these are new young trees that need a lot of care when they're first planted. If someone can kind of speak to all of that, and then I may have some follow-up questions. Thank you so much.
So, Councilor, Chief Cook actually went in.
Great detail.
Yeah, a lot of detail on that particular matter. Specifically, BTD is the lead on that, so maybe if we could set up some time to sit with you and your staff to talk through, bring the right agencies to the table just to talk through some of the concerns. We're definitely hearing them, and I think the chief had some responses. I don't think, you know, I think it's an ongoing conversation, so we would welcome that dialogue so we can really kind of bring you up to speed on kind of the efforts that are being undertaken relative to Mass and Molina Ave.
Okay. I mean, I think that's it for me. I may have some additional questions. That was the thing that was most pressing for me, is really understanding the Melnia Cass situation. Obviously, I think preserving our tree canopies across the city are very important in terms of the quality of life issues and our air quality, and want to support the efforts of the council and the administration, as well as the advocates, in doing as much as we can to preserve that. So I think I will pause for now and perhaps just ask some follow-up.
I will say just one thing on the ongoing maintenance, and as we look at, you know, public parcels of land that have large green space and stuff like that, we're always, if there's public-private partnerships, particularly from new development that we can create, we're always kind of evaluating that when projects are coming in. So as you know, there's a lot going on in that corridor, potentially for future development, so I think that's one area where there could be a lot of synergy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Janey. I just had a couple of follow-up questions as well. So Jill, you had, could you go back for a second? I wasn't sure I was following closely enough. You said that there's no specific policy now that the BPDA has around trees, or what were you referring to around? You said there was no specific policy around tree removal, or?
When a project is brought forth and we recognize that it's difficult for them to work around a tree, there's no specific policy with regard to how many trees we ask to replace the existing tree.
Okay.
Typically, I follow the Parks Department standard for public street tree removals. So they have an equation for the number of inches of caliper determines the number of replacement trees. That's generally my rule of thumb, but I would say no less than 2, replacing, you know, even the smallest tree. So like if we're removing a 3 or 4 inch caliper tree, we're getting at least 2 trees to replace it.
Okay, and what is the, what's the kind of mechanism or teeth behind what your decision is? So are you making a recommendation, or are you saying that they're not getting the permit until they do that, or where's that authority coming from?
So the BPDA, the urban design staff, has to stamp and sign drawings for them to proceed to ISD to get permits. So the landscape plans are always a part of that set. I don't stamp and sign, but Michael does, and we obviously work very closely together. So I will review the plans and assert to him that it meets kind of a minimum standard that we've kind of come up with, again, anecdotally in our staff. And I'm the only landscape architect, so it kind of begins and ends with me with regard to
So if you just tomorrow wanted to go, say, double the number of trees compared to what we're doing for street trees, that's your decision to make, or is there, I mean, is it all just what you're saying to the developers?
Counselor, when we approve a set of plans, we also attach a set of provisos usually. So we would have a list of, say, they need to submit all the signage for a business to us for review. We would put in one of the standards is that the minimum size of a tree has to be 3 to 3.5 inches caliper. If there's cases where they're removing a lot of trees, we could add provisos that they need to add 2 trees for every tree. So that's part of our review, and that becomes part of the record that ISD has in the jacket or the file for the building.
And is there ever a mechanism for public feedback into that from the neighbors? Because it feels, so I'm also now speaking as a constituent and a resident on a street in Roslindale where there are multiple development projects right doors, literally next door or 2 doors up from me, where this has been heartbreaking for my neighbors and me. Huge 100-year trees taken down, and in one case, a little further up the street, neighbors calling me panicked that trees that they thought were going to be kept in this project were now coming down. Me then frantically calling BPDA and others to find out what had happened, and now we hear through the grapevine that the developer actually is punishing the neighborhood because we put him through the embarrassment of that. He's not making any progress on that project now, so it's just been sitting unfinished for a very long time now because of that conversation about the trees and that I dared to walk over there and talk to the BPDA, et cetera. So there's a lot of emotion attached to trees, and it feels that there's not a mechanism for abutters or neighbors to have any input into. If it's really just one person making a decision, it feels like there might be a way for you to hear from some neighbors, and then you could set a different requirement after you've done so.
So through the development review process, we obviously conduct, we go out and do public meetings, and obviously neighborhoods advocacy on certain, sometimes it's trees, sometimes it's public realm, sometimes it's height density. When the project manager in front of is running a public meeting, kind of evaluating these things. If these things are brought up, we really try to make sure that the developer is engaging these residents to try to address some of these concerns as it relates. So if it's a tree concern, then we really push the developer. Through Article 80 and small and large projects, we have the ability to do that. I think sometimes the ZBA cases are the ones that this doesn't get caught. Through the abutters meetings and stuff like that, that's another area where we would encourage the developers to really engage their direct abutters, to make sure, and their neighbors to find out kind of what are the specific issues that they can work on throughout the process to try to get some consensus relative to moving the project forward. Some developers are very sensitive to this and really want to work and get an agreement with their neighbors. Other developers aren't. When it's in Article 80, we do have the ability to sign off on plans, and we have a lot more authority to kind of be to catch a lot of these things. The ZBA is the area. I think one thing that we have encouraged when we're doing, if it's early design review and say we're hearing from community residents, is that when a developer, particularly on a zoning issue that's not going to be going in front of our board, but we go in front of the zoning board of appeals, that if they say that they're going to put a tree, you should make sure that you see the plans to show that tree, so that when it's in front of, it becomes a part of the approved plan that's in front of the zoning board of appeals. I think we try to evaluate what are the issues relative to specific projects and really try to push the developers to try to address those. In certain instances, a tree might be in the middle of the property and it really is difficult to save, but then we'd ask them to try to how are you going to try to mitigate that relative to the overall project?
But right now,
just to add to that, we often don't hear from the neighbors. We do hear from the developers. So we often would encourage and welcome if the neighbors would contact us and at least let us know what the issues are. The design review portion of the ZBA cases is basically between us and the applicant. But we would certainly welcome comments. They can email us, they can send us a letter, so we understand what the issues are the neighbors have on that particular project.
So could you remind me, is there a requirement for a public meeting when design review is triggered?
No.
So right now, how do you?
Well, design review is usually required after zoning board of appeals, which would have had a public meeting.
Right. So it's usually a proviso that the Board of Appeals will put on particular case that they would want us to do design review. And mainly it's because they're concerned about what's being proposed and making sure that it fits into the overall character of the neighborhood and the street.
But right now, the agency, what I'm hearing is that the agency has almost total control in terms of telling the developer what they need to do to replace any trees that are being affected. And we're sort of waiting to see if anyone reaches out from the community to give feedback on that. But if, for example, we counselors hear their concerns and we called Jill, that you could ask the developer to do more than you would have otherwise.
Absolutely. And neighbors do often call me. I'm limited by the process. If it's a ZBA case, I can certainly, if there's opportunity, make change.
I would also just encourage, obviously, from you guys to contact the developers, obviously through ONS to have them contact them. They're running the meetings. That if a tree is the issue, the developer should be responsive to that issue to try to mitigate the best they can. I think, like I said, from Article 80 perspective, we have a lot more purview because we're running the process. When it gets in a zoning board of appeals, that is a little bit of a gray area. But we're always available if there is specific projects that you're hearing on, particularly around trees or open space, and you want to flag for us, we'd be more than happy to look into it and contact either the architect or the developer to talk through it and understand it.
I'm going to get Jill's direct number after this and be calling her often.
Can I just also add, there's a number of as-of-right, I live in Roslindale also, and there's a number of as-of-right projects there that I'm surprised when I walk or drive or bike by that trees have gone because I wasn't aware that there was even a project happening there. I understand the concern, certainly, but when there's an as-of-right situation, I don't have a role to play.
And that's where some of the changes that Councilor McCarthy's talking about. Okay, sorry to take over on this one subject. The other related but small piece that I had on this was that in the cases where I've been part of meetings with the developers engaging with abutters and kind of sort of negotiating around trees, et cetera, often we will be told, oh, I did an independent study. We had our own landscape architect or tree consultant come out. They found that this 100-year oak was actually sick anyway, so gotta go. And we just had to take their word for it, and it went, and that was that. But are there resources at the city or at the BPDA to provide some sort of second opinion or on the tree health or something else? Because right now it feels like the developers are providing the quote-unquote expertise, and they obviously have a motive for it to turn out a certain way.
Right. Usually I will ask for the report and then ask if I can, call and talk to the arborist about the assessment that they've made. Because a landscape architect wouldn't make an assessment, it would be an arborist. So if it's just a landscape architect making the assessment, then I would ask for an arborist assessment as a follow-up. And that has happened in the past where, there's a little bit of miscommunication or misunderstanding about, who the experts are and who can actually make those qualifying statements as, and if they're true.
Right. Yes, the latest meeting with one in the neighborhood was that we would get a arborist report back, but I already know what it's going to say.
Yeah, I think, Council, we'd be happy to engage. I don't have the specific project in front of me. We'd happy to engage with
Okay.
you any way we can be helpful.
Thank
as it
you.
relates to that. And we had
do
some
any of
early
my-
conversations on that. But
Thank you all very much. Do my colleagues have more questions?
Just quick, I know there's a couple people who want to speak, so I don't want to take up their time. I think, I don't have any more questions really, but just a closing statement for me would be, obviously it sounds like we need a better policy for before, during, and after projects. We need to have Public Works at the table because I think, as Chief Cook alluded to, I'm a huge supporter of the rubberized sidewalks in and around. And for those people who don't or haven't seen them in the neighborhood, in your regular street tree pit, they kind of dig down about an inch or two, and then they pour this in hot. It comes in, it pours in hot, and it ends up looking like a Rice Krispie treat. That's really what it looks like. So the water goes right through the Rice Krispie treat, and then as the tree grows, the arborist will come out and just cut that circle around the Rice Krispie treat a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. it gets plenty of water so the roots don't come to the surface and don't wreck the sidewalks. It's also ADA compliant, so if the sidewalk is a little bit skinnier than a normal sidewalk, we can still roll a wheelchair over or roll a carriage over. There's a couple of them outside of Blackstone Park, so if you want to take a look at them. When I was in the Parks, Public Works Department, we put them out there. I've checked them, and they're still in great shape. So I think we should be pushing that in a big, big way. And then I think for me anyway, I mean, obviously, Greg Mossman does a great job with the Parks Department, but he runs around like a crazy person. He can't possibly, with 1,600 miles of sidewalk and all of our parks, he can't possibly do the job all by himself. So, you know, we may have to look at some, you know, a little people power might be in order here as well. And then for me personally, my action items would be really simple. I'm going to put together and pull apart all of the information that I have here, kind of put together a one-pager or maybe a two-pager bullet items that I think from local towns, local communities, cities, or even other states have to make Boston have the most solid policy regarding removal of trees, planting of trees, restart that the private tree fund. I never knew why that went away. I think it'd be an outstanding sell, and I don't think it'd be tough to sell to the people of Boston. You want a free tree in your yard, sign up here. I think you're going to get a lot of people signing up there. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm looking forward to that to the LIDAR review, and I think this is kind of a perfect timing now to get this all in order. And I want to thank Chairperson Wu for having the hearing and certainly indulging us on having another working session in the coming months. And thank you guys for being here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy. Councilor Janey?
Thank you so much. Thank you again for being here. Just, I guess, I'm thinking of a project that was just approved yesterday by the ZBA, and there was, you know, this was a BPDA project. This was the Alexandra Hotel. And some of the feedback from residents who were engaged in the IAG process and at the different community meetings really worried that there wasn't enough guidance or like a value statement around from the city and BPDA around what we want to see in terms of improvements to the public realm or tree preservation, et cetera. So I just think about how I evaluate projects in terms of my own criteria, and those things do make the cut in terms of what I consider before deciding to weigh in with support or opposition for a project. And so I am wondering, and I think, you know, I was hearing this in some of the chairpersons questioning, what value statement do we have as a city or as an agency around tree preservation, preserving tree canopies when development projects happen, or on other things, whether it's, you know, public realm investments. And so there was, the residents were pushing for some things, and some of the advocacy groups were pushing for some things. I, as a counselor, was pushing for some things. And there was just a concern, and I don't know, I mean, there could be a value statement or a policy already in place, but it was just, it felt like a disconnect. So I just wanted to lift that up here to understand what you guys are saying to developers around what is important when it comes to development in the city of Boston, whether we're talking about tree canopies, which is the purpose of this hearing, or, you know, other important things that I think I certainly value, I think my colleagues on the council value, many of the residents and advocates value. So I'd like a better understanding of that.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously it could be a pretty robust conversation as it relates to kind of public realm. I think, you know, there's a lot of things that go into it. Tree canopies definitely play you know, and shade and all that stuff plays an important role. Accessibility, complete streets, a lot of those we have very specific guidelines around kind of what we want to see around accessibility and stuff like that. I think trees is the area that, you know, the city, when a tree is on a public right of way, there is some guidelines as it relates to that. I think when it gets into the kind of removal of trees on private property, that's where we could definitely do some work and some collaboration. I think from a public realm perspective, there is a pretty, you know, there's a lot of sets of guidelines that we kind of work through. The Alexander was a unique one, obviously, because there's a bus the bus stop is directly outside the site, which made this a little bit more of a challenging conversation when you're, and the site is restricted in the fact that they're keeping the existing building and kind of building behind, so the public realm is somewhat limited. I don't know, Jill, if you have anything, or Michael, just to add like big picture. I think trees is an area that we feel like we could definitely do some more, collaboration on that. We can always do collaboration, but from a public realm standpoint, I think we do have pretty big things, principles that we kind of work through.
I just want to add, normally people think of us as just reviewing the design of the building, but I think equally, if not more important at times, is the public realm piece, where we push back on development, even from the Board of Appeal cases, where someone's putting a new building in, say, South Boston. We're very aware of what the dimensions, for example, of the sidewalk is in front of a new building. We're looking to make sure that it meets the current accessibility standards. As you may know, that some of the streets, say in South Boston, are only 3 feet, if anything. Then there's usually a light pole in the middle of that 3-foot narrow sidewalk. So Jill and I have been working with the Commission on Disabilities on this issue. I'm just using South Boston as an example to make sure that we get an adequate sidewalk. But for any project, especially the large and small projects, the public realm is a very important piece, making sure that the sidewalks are wide, that they have adequate street trees, that the surface materials, so that's a very important piece.
Right, and over the last 5 years or so, I've gotten into the weeds on design process. Parks Department has a separate design process. Certainly BTD and DPW are looking at it from a different perspective. I work with Disabilities Commission, with the Historic Commissions. I have a very deep understanding of what all of those design processes are and what the expectations are coming out of those. So we try to front load all of that with developers to help them really understand what the expectations are out there as they move from our process into these other design review processes. And that all culminates in the Public Improvement Commission again, and I make comment to that. So Amy Cording and Todd Liming, who head up that effort, they really look to me to make sure that what's being proposed for development is going to gel with what is expected at the end of the PIC process. So we work really closely together. We talk often. We've actually instituted, I think, a bi-monthly meeting to start talking about projects that are problematic. I agree with Mike. We can certainly do better around trees, but we are also trying to balance a lot of other policy issues with regard to, adding bike facilities and improving accessibility around the city. So there's a lot of competing interests for our very narrow rights of way. And I'm speaking as loudly and as often as I can for the trees. I can't say that I always win, especially when it comes to other important, I think Melnia Cass is a good example. The bike facilities there, I think, will be transformative for the city. We really are working hard and understand the goals from BTD and DPW about mobility balance. And in this case, the trees, unfortunately, are going to lose out, but I want to echo what Chief Cook said about, the fact that the project is really trying to serve many masters, and it's unfortunate that a lot of mature trees are being lost in the process. But I think we're all, as a staff, trying to look well into the future for the benefit of the city and making sure that every project that we're doing in the city is to the ultimate benefit of the city. And unfortunately, it means we have to make some hard decisions about, existing trees versus future kind of ability to get around the city in an equitable way. So I just can't stress enough. I mean, I've reached out to everybody who does design review in the city to understand what they want so that we can really work hard with developers to get the city the best possible projects that are really meeting the needs of the city and really doing well by the public realm in the city, because that's all I work on every day.
Thank you. One other question. You mentioned, sir, that you don't hear from the public, the residents in these processes, and I want to put that question back out to you. What can you do to improve or create a platform to then hear from residents and the public? So if you're only hearing from developers, I think that's problematic. And so I'm this gentleman in the middle.
No, I can just.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I think he was just talking through when he's dealing with zoning board of appeals design review. The developer, after they get their approval, has to come to us. So they basically, as the process works, it's the developer and the design reviewer. So I think us understanding when our urban design team is reviewing plans, what are some of the major issues that were happening? This is more from a ZBA perspective. So if we're hearing from council's office, mayor's office of neighborhood services, directly from residents, that can help us when they're just dealing with the developer to say, hey, this was something that I got flagged for me, and your plans aren't showing it. I can't sign off on this until I know you've met that. So I think that's what
Yeah, so I want to make sure that we're closing that loop, because then it's problematic if you're just hearing from one and not really doing the check to see
Totally.
if there are these problems or these flags that we need to make sure. So whatever it is, I think we need to think about how we are making sure that the voices of people who are going to be directly impacted by these development projects are being included at every step of the way. And so if there is kind of this blind spot, I want to be aware of it and try to figure out how we're getting voices, and maybe it's the counselors weighing in when we hear from residents. But I just want to make sure that we're closing that loop, that I don't ever want to hear we only hear from developers and we're not hearing from people.
The design review, approve a design review, I think that should not, you should just know that triggers our review, so that you should always feel comfortable reaching out to say, hey, I spoke in favor of this project, but one of the things they committed to was X.
Exactly.
And I need to make sure that that's in there.
Exactly.
And we welcome those conversations, because the last thing we want to do is have something get through the process, and then, once it starts going up, people are like, oh, you didn't do X, and then and then all of us are in a tough place.
Right.
So the more, collaboration we can have on the front end, the better. So
So thank you.
100%.
I look forward to continuing the conversation and working sessions and continuing to work with residents and advocates around this and other issues. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Janey. Before we move fully to the rest of public testimony, the 1, 2, 3 folks who have been so patient, thank you. I wonder if you could just give a quick reaction to the chart that Ms. Blair had put together around the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 projects. Do you have a copy?
No.
Here.
No. Great, thank you. And there are additional copies coming from Ms. Blair herself.
So just to read out, can I borrow this, Kim, for a
Yes,
second?
please.
Just to read off the addresses. These are all in the Claremont-Chester Square neighborhoods: 150 Camden Street, 527 Mass Ave, LIHC on Worcester Street, Northampton Street, Newcastle Saranac at the Southwest Corridor Park, Harriet Tubman House, 770 Tremont Street, and Alexandra Hotel. According to this chart, 79% of the trees on the area are likely to be lost or damaged by development, and many of these are BPDA involved projects. So I didn't know if you had a reaction.
Just getting this, I would maybe take a little time to review it just before we officially respond, because there could be a lot of nuances within the projects of what they're doing. I know some of these are still under review, some of them are approved. So I would want to take a minute and we'd welcome to sit with the residents to talk through some of this to better understand kind of their concern and how we can be helpful through the development review process.
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of the project, so we'd have to look at the plans.
Yeah, I just think some of the, through the chair, I think some of the issue that we're having is the whole as-of-right tree removal. We might want to take a look at that and see, I don't know if we can, as a city, put an ordinance in, but at least we can get to some of these developers and say, before you decide to, we can make it more difficult for people to build if they clear-cut lots. And I think the message has to just kind of be sent out there. I've got another one on Reedville Street, the corner of Reedville and the Ponce Valley Parkway. He's going to build a single and a double as of right, kind of talk to the developer, look through thing, Lorax, everything's gone. and now we're waiting. I think he triggered something else. I think he worked on a holiday or something, so I think the ISD's kind of sticking it to him as far as the continuance. But it still comes back to, you know, he clear-cut the lot, and I think developers just need to know that Boston cares more now than ever that doesn't happen. So, you know, again, that'll be in the working session, but we should start kind of thinking about that, and I'll be pulling some stuff from other ordinances. I think there's a way around
maybe for the working session, we can use this as a case study. Because I'm looking, most of these, you know, Alexander I know has its zoning. The rest of them are still in the under review stage. So this might be a good chart to kind of work through to see how we could even, you know, pull up plans to show you how we really evaluate things from the beginning to the end, if that's helpful.
That would be so helpful. And yeah, if you could keep us in the loop on any follow-up, just the 80% number, 80% trees likely to be lost by project that the city has direct feedback on seems painful. But we support all of your work. We just want to give you more teeth and authority to do it. And again, it's across every neighborhood now. So that's all for councilor questions. There are 3 folks left to testify. So if you could stay, you know, feel free to find more comfortable seats to listen. But the 3 folks are Ken Krookemeyer, Allison Poltinas, and Maureen Lannon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor McCarthy, Councilor Wu, Councilor Janey. I'm Ken Krookemeyer. I moved into the South End 52 years ago, and my kids who went to Boston Public Schools named the 2 startup trees that were volunteers in our backyard, George and Martha. Some other trees have come and gone, but Martha and George have grown taller than the 5-story row house that we live in. And George is unwell, and I'm going to have to take George down because George is dying. I tell you this story because I care about trees. There's a tree out in front of my house. Trees have changed over the generation, more than generation that I've lived there. And I want to get into the real purpose of this hearing, I think, which is a discussion of whether it is appropriate for the city to have further regulations about private property and trees on private property. And I want to say that it's important to understand that private property has public impacts and public property has private impacts. And so if you're designing, whether it's Melnick Boulevard or the building that might take place on Worcester Street, in both cases, there are implications that go to, in Melnia's case, the private adjacent property and the folks who live there. And in the Worcester Street, the folks who are on the street and who live in the South End. And so we have a question of how do we balance these things? There are both laws and guidelines that try to establish zoning, that try to tell you what you should do. And those guidelines very frequently set up alternatives. In the case of the bikeways, for instance, on Melnick, there are different ways of doing bikeways. And so an engineer, a planner, will choose among those alternatives to try to come up with the right answer. If everybody always came up with the right answer on public property and on private property, we'd all be happy and we wouldn't worry about changing these things. But the laws are not that. The laws give you an opportunity to be responsible to try to resolve both public and private opportunities as well as liabilities in any project. And so to speak to that, I've been trying to think about what kind of guidance I might give you over the years that I've been involved in these kinds of projects. And I recall a situation when I was a highway commissioner for Massachusetts in the 1980s where a private developer owned some land which was designated as industrial land and where he had the full right within zoning to build a big box warehouse on that piece of land. It turned out that piece of land was in the center of the town's well field. And so if he stopped all that rain from getting into the groundwater, he was going to ruin the town's groundwater opportunity to provide water to the entire town and be taking the water from the roof and putting it as legally required into the adjacent stream where it would not then provide the town with water. How do you resolve these kinds of things? And if the zoning had been different in the first place, if it's understood the relationship of groundwater to land cover for industrial use, the developer might not have ever even thought to buy the land to put this building on it. What do we do about this kind of a very difficult conundrum of public policy? And I would suggest that you look at Section 4F of the Federal Highway Administration's guidelines for roadways that are now part of the National Environmental Policy Act, and which establish what can be done with respect to highways on parks and historic sites. And if we try to apply that to this question of trees on private land, we might realize that the words that are in that regulation, that it cannot be, you cannot take public parks or historic sites unless there is no feasible and prudent alternative that avoids those parks or historic sites. Feasible and prudent is a really important thing, and if you do determine there is no feasible or prudent alternative, then it requires that the project include all possible planning to minimize harm. And so if we thought of that in terms of trees on private parcels, if we thought that you couldn't approve the project unless the developer had really looked at all possible ways of avoiding cutting those trees, and if it was determined that he couldn't build something that was as of right, he had then could proceed, but only under the condition that all possible planning was done to minimize harm. So that's alternative trees, that's moving the buildings around, having this footprint rather than that footprint. You might come up with a strategy that protected the trees in the city of Boston in a way that is not so dissimilar to the way at a national level we've determined that public parks should be protected from highways. So I suggest that as a strategy that might be thought about. I would love to answer more questions of Councilor Janey about Melnia Cass. There are many specifics that have come up here in the process of the hearing, which I'd love to be able to respond to. I won't take time to do that now, but I'll request that we have an opportunity to do that because I think the council does deserve some answers on Melnia Cass. And I truly think that right now is the time when the council must do something to prevent the destruction of those 60, or the city has even said 100 trees, and even more importantly, the 258 trees that the city says they will be undermining by the work that they are doing, the roots they will be destroying in the process. So we're going to lose a lot more trees on Melnia Cass than what they are telling you, and that's a particularly critical issue on the Heat Island. Thank you. I'd love to continue outside of this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allison?
Hi, my name is Allison Pultenus. I live in Mission Hill, and thank you very much for this hearing. It's been very informative, and there's some ideas I wanted to follow up on. I am very concerned that we need policies actually related to the zoning code, and my counselor, Counselor O'Malley, started to discuss this. I think one suggestion that came up, and he and Ayanna Presley held a hearing last year on a similar topic, was the idea of a designated heat overlay district. And this is an environmental justice issue that connects with the Climate Ready Boston report and updates on that, is that it would be a policy kind of like the groundwater overlay district, where you use the data that the city has already researched and say these are the neighborhoods where tree loss will really impact residents. And in that sense, development, whether it's as of right or if it's a public improvement project, will take an extra thoughtful approach to trees and working around the existing trees. As David from Speak for the Trees mentioned, the BU professor, and I heard her speak a couple years ago, the most important issue is preserving what we have. It's the mature shade trees that are 30 years old, 15 feet high. Those are the ones that are influencing the climate. And the replacement value for new trees is not, first of all, that's not really working very well right now either. But young trees have a very hard time surviving in the urban environment. Chief Cook said that directly today. It's sort of like children. There's so many toxic environment factors in the city that, and like children, young trees are much more vulnerable to those factors. So they don't survive. And we've all seen it. We've seen those sidewalk trees being replaced year after year, despite warranties, and each tree is at least $1,000, and it really is a waste of money. So you want to focus on those older, mature shade trees, and going back to the example of Milnia Cass, which I, along with the others here, have mentioned before, and I think this is very valuable, that Councilor McCarthy is studying what other cities and towns are doing. I was involved with the Urban Forestry Coalition that BNAN set up a few years ago, and they went far afield and studied what, DC, Seattle, California, even Tucson was doing. And the replacement value was not 2 for 1 for every tree. It depended on the caliber of tree that was being lost. And so, for example, if you have a tree with a diameter breast height, that's how the arborists measure them, of more than 18 inches, the replacement value was supposed to be 5 to 1. This is from Seattle, 5 to 1. Okay, the inventory of the trees of Milnia Cass and BTD and Mass DOT hired a state arborist to do the work. He inventoried over 500 trees. More than 130 of those trees have calipers of more than 18 inches. That means, and most of those trees are going to be impacted by the excavation. So it's not just the trees that they've already said are going to be cut down, it's the trees whose critical root zones are being impacted, because the city did pay for a landscape architect to do that study. And he said 258 trees are being affected. So if you have a ratio of 5 to 1 for the loss of 120 trees, you're talking 500 trees. You're not talking 200. So, and that's just those trees, those larger trees. So we really have to focus on tree canopy, but we have to focus it to data that shows where are people being impacted the most. And they're being impacted the most where you're getting that new development that's paving over green space, and where the city has already said there's heat island issues. And that includes Roxbury, that includes South Boston, where there's very few trees, and potentially other areas. But I'm encouraged by the idea that there's going to be a new urban forest management plan, and I'm encouraged by hearing about working zone sessions. But this is a crisis, and Milnia is happening very soon. So I hope you're paying attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maureen.
Thank you. My name's Maureen Lannon, and I live in Jamaica Plain. And I recently read the Carbon-Free Boston report, and I'm very interested in the heat island issue. And trees, obviously, we've heard so many wonderful things about the trees. Because we need to intensify the building of residential places near our work sites, it's unrealistic to some extent to be able to expect to have the land in order to replace or retain our tree canopy as much as we want to. And just sort of in looking at these reports and thinking about it, There are some services that the trees provide that, such as cooling, such as adding water to the ground, that we can mitigate with our buildings and the type of material that we use on the roofs of the buildings, as well as the type of materials that we use to pave the roads or parking lots. We have authority, or someone has. I just joined Boston Climate Action Network about a month ago, and I haven't done all of the studying to understand what kind of ordinances we have in place right now to mitigate the heat island effect with cool surfaces. But I would really strongly encourage this as part of the mix when we're looking at these old trees and we're trying to put in place near-term, 3 to 5 year benefits. We can calculate some of those benefits and could come from having a certain length of roadway that's paved with a light color and a porous material. And that would add some flexibility in terms of the types of responses we have on our plate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to testify at this time? Any final words from my colleagues?
Oh, I just want to thank everybody for coming here. I want to thank the panel for being here, and clearly we have a lot of work to do. I know that one of the previous speakers had mentioned Seattle. I know that Oregon just came out with another ordinance package, and they're getting very aggressive. So I haven't read that one yet, so I will before the next hearing, or before the next working session, and I look forward to working with everybody. I think this is one step in the right direction.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy. Councilor Janey?
I just wanted to say thank you again for everyone who showed up and for your important testimony, to the panel, to the chairwoman, as well as the sponsor of this very important hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll look forward to setting a date for the working session to continue the conversation, and this will conclude the hearing on docket number 1045, order for a hearing regarding the expansion of city development requirements with a focus on achieving baseline tree preservation and total tree capacity on a development site. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.